Credit Suisse has been found guilty of failing to prevent money laundering.
It's the first such conviction for a Swiss bank. The story involves a brutal drug trafficking kingpin from Bulgaria.
It's far from the first scandal involving Credit Suisse.
Hello and welcome to The Nexus. Today we're looking at money laundering. In particular, what's been going on at Credit Suisse. It's one of Switzerland's biggest and most prestigious banks, and yet last week it was convicted of failing to stop a drugs baron from washing his ill-gotten gains through their books. In a moment, we'll be talking about this story with a former Swiss banker who became a whistleblower. Plus, we'll hear from the real undercover agent who inspired this film.
I'm an undercover narcotics agent. I sit with murderers and made men, and I lie.
Looks like a fascinating movie, but first, let's get to the Credit Suisse story and the remarkable tale of the bank and the Bulgarian drug gang. From the outside, Credit Suisse looks the model of propriety. It's Switzerland's second biggest bank and has been running since 1856, 166 years of history. Its brand ambassador, Roger Federer, is a perfect match, Swiss respectability personified. But lately, this once venerable institution has lost its sparkle. Behind the facade, some very shady goings-on. A recent trial in Switzerland, the first of its kind, revealed that a convicted drug trafficker, Evelyn Banev, had been using the bank to launder his drug money between 2004 and 2008. His person on the inside was a Credit Suisse client relationship manager who we're not allowed to name because of Swiss banking laws. So in court, she was only referred to as E. Both Banev and E are Bulgarian, and both were national athletes. The 57-year-old Banev had been a wrestler, and 50-year-old E was once a pro tennis player. The court heard evidence that E regularly handled suitcases stuffed full of cash given to her by Banev's associates, including one who was shot dead outside a restaurant in Sofia in 2005. Altogether, she apparently handled $150 million worth of transactions, helping to conceal their criminal origins. The court also heard testimony about the Banev gang's criminal activities, including drug smuggling from Latin America and even murder. In her defense, the former banker made it clear she was a novice and denied any wrongdoing. Most of these matters were decided at a higher level above me. I was not involved in it. The bank also denied any wrongdoing, claiming it is continuously testing its anti-money laundering framework and has been strengthening it over time, in accordance with evolving regulatory standards. But Switzerland's highest criminal court found E guilty of money laundering and gave her a suspended 20-month prison sentence, plus a suspended fine of about $2 million. It found her employer guilty of failing to prevent money laundering despite all the red flags, and fined the bank the same, $2 million. The bank was also ordered to hand over the money related to the gang's accounts, another $18 million. That is a tiny sum for a bank that handles billions of dollars every year. But analysts say the fact that the Swiss authorities went after the banks at all is a sign that the international pressure, coming especially from the United States, is finally beginning to take effect. But what of Banev, you ask? What happened to him? Well, he wasn't a defendant in the case, but he is currently being held in Ukraine, awaiting extradition to Bulgaria and Romania, where he faces numerous criminal charges. Okay, time to bring in our guest now, and we have Rudolph Elmer, a former Swiss banker who got into quite a lot of trouble for giving bank secrets to Julian Assange and Wikileaks. And we have Tom Stocks, who is a senior investigator with the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Welcome to both of you. Tom, I'd like to start with you. You know, in its defense, the bank said that it thought that the money was being deposited by legitimate businesses, construction, leasing, and hotels, and so on. What do you make of that defense?
Well, I think one of the things that the judgment has made clear is that the bank was not adhering to the sufficient anti-money laundering policies, both the internal directors of the bank, but also what it was federally required to do according to the Swiss regulatory practices in order to prevent this stuff. It does make the bank complicit and responsible in facilitating the laundering of cash funds from criminal origin.
And what did you make of the fine? Around $2 million, and then also the money being taken that was deposited by the gangsters.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the fine is pretty insignificant for a bank of Credit Suisse's size. A 2 million franc fine is very low, as is the confiscated funds. But this isn't really about the fine. I think the more significant thing here is the criminal conviction. It's quite a historic conviction. I think it's the second ever criminal conviction for money laundering of a Swiss bank, and the first of a major Swiss bank. Credit Suisse being the second biggest bank in Switzerland. So that sends a real message. Unfortunately, a bank can't do jail time. And although one Credit Suisse relationship manager was convicted and held responsible, there's no responsibility leveled against the senior management of the bank. And that's potentially a missed opportunity as well.
Yeah, and the employee in question, she said that she was fairly junior, she wasn't really that well trained, and that she did report some of the suspicious red flags to her superiors, but it wasn't really acted on.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think one of the things you see in the announcement for the judgment is that the bank created the conditions in which this was able to happen. Even if what you just said is true, the judgment establishes that she was not following the rules sufficiently to prevent this kind of stuff from happening at the bank.
Yeah, and the judge said she failed to perform her role as the bank's first line of defence. But as I say, she countered with the argument that she was quite junior about it. Just looking broadly at Swiss banks, is it typical that the more junior officials tend to take the fall and are blamed, and the higher-ups, say they didn't know anything about it?
I think that's probably a fair assessment for a lot of these cases with Swiss banks. It's quite rare to see senior management figures and board figures really take responsibility, do jail time, lose their professional license and right to be a banker and things like that. I think that's what's needed in order to prevent this kind of criminal activity from taking place. And until we see those kind of punishments, we're going to continue to see these activities happening in Swiss banks.
Rudolph Elmer, are you encouraged that this is sort of the first case of its kind, really, has taken place now?
No, I'm not encouraged at all. I mean, the fine is actually a parking fine, and Junior is responsible. And you're talking about money of $55 million, which was placed with Credit Suisse. Now, if a Junior has the responsibility to accept $55 million, it's simply ridiculous. It's definitely top management has known about it and must have approved it. That's for sure. So I don't think it's going to be changed a lot. It's just a political ruling because the case was so clear that a verdict had to be, and someone has to be found guilty. But it's a political issue. The legal verdict is, from my point of view, driven by the pressure from the outside of Switzerland.
And the Swiss banking laws are still intact, from what I hear. Article 47, sort of notorious Article 47, it's known as. In May, apparently this year, Swiss politicians voted against loosening the law.
What's really happening is, since 2011, the fines were increased by 6 times. So it means the fine is 250,000 Swiss francs. On top of it, someone could go to prison maximum time of 3 years. And actually, they use now the so-called Espionage Act to prosecute people who provide information. So what's really happening on the Swiss bank secrecy side, and the system has strengthened very much so. It's even the journalists. I mean, in 2015, the Swiss parliament decided that even journalists are on the Swiss bank secrecy. Obviously, now everybody's on the Swiss bank secrecy in Switzerland. So what's really happening is the secrecy jurisdiction is getting more and more secret, and it's going after truth tellers, call it whistleblower or whatever, with a lot of power, because we don't have in Switzerland any whistleblower protection law. So it's getting worse, in my view.
Could we just come to your case? You're known as a whistleblower. You gave secrets of your bank, Julius Baer, to Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. Why did you feel the need to do that?
Actually, I did it because I tried to do it in Switzerland, first of all, with the authorities. I filed a complaint with the Federal Prosecution Office that was denied. I went to the tax authorities, provided information. No one wanted to really know about it because my case was clearly silenced. So I was lucky in 2008 when WikiLeaks published some information. Otherwise, my case would have kept secret for forever. I mean, Swiss media didn't report about my case. They actually only reported my person, that I'm a mentally sick person or something like that.
Yes, can I bring that up, please? Because just for full disclosure, I'm sure you're more than capable of defending yourself. As I said, you're known as a whistleblower, but your case is a bit complicated, isn't it? Because you were convicted of breaking Swiss banking secrecy laws, but that conviction was overturned, but you remain convicted of forging a letter from your former bank to the former Chancellor, Angela Merkel, and coercion. Can you clear this up for us?
Yeah, very easily. I mean, the letter to Merkel, which I falsified, was the first information I sent to WikiLeaks. In order to find out in 2008 if WikiLeaks even publishes information which they receive. So I falsified this letter, and after that, when WikiLeaks published that letter, I was certain things what I'm going to send them after that publishing will be published by WikiLeaks. So they will not confiscated or not made public at all. So it's something what really happened in Switzerland when I provided Swiss newspapers with the information about the clients. They didn't really publish anything at all, on the contrary.
I just want to pause for a moment. You know, it's been a fascinating story so far, but as I mentioned, Banev is not the only unsavory character to have banked with Credit Suisse. In February, it was reported that all types of clients involved in torture, drug trafficking, money laundering, corruption, and other serious crimes had accounts there, including the late Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda, who stole billions from their country. There's also Egypt's former vice president, Omar Suleiman, who's accused of presiding over widespread torture in Egypt. And then there's the alleged Serbian drug lord, Rudolph Radulovic, apparently very senior in a Balkans drug cartel. Credit Suisse responded to the report saying it strongly rejects the allegations and inferences about the bank's purported business practices. The matters presented are predominantly historical, in some cases dating back as far as the 1960s, including at a time where laws, practices, and expectations of financial institutions were very different from where they are now. Now, all this information and much more was leaked by someone or a group of people to the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung about a year before it was published. The paper then shared it with dozens of other media companies all over the world, including The Guardian, The New York Times, and the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And therefore, of course, Tom was involved in the report. Tom, the leak was of 30,000 accounts, over $100 billion there. At least $8 billion was found to be held by some very dodgy and nasty people. Why did you feel you had the right to publish this sensitive and private material?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, whenever we have these kind of leaks, we're always very careful to publish only what we see as being in the public interest. You know, there were many account holders in this data who were private individuals, not public officials and the like, who had accounts, and we had no interest in publishing on those individuals. We were focusing on the people we found in the data, which included money launderers, fraudsters, individuals involved in corruption and bribery, you know, politically exposed persons with enormous wealth in accounts, and those kind of figures. The people who you referred to as the problematic customers, who we tied to around $8 billion worth of assets in the bank.
Is it possible to quantify any good that came out of this expose?
Well, like many of these leaks, you know, these exposés help drive the narrative and the conversation around offshore secrecy, around banking, offshore centres. You know, as you mentioned before, in May, there was a movement to challenge Article 47 of the banking secrecy laws in Switzerland, which unfortunately was unsuccessful and blocked by a parliamentary committee. These things take time. Change doesn't happen overnight. We see this as a very positive step, at least, to have that dialogue rolling.
Kind of embarrassing for Switzerland, isn't it? I mean, it's held in such high esteem, and yet media organisations, including yours, all over the world had a chance to examine this data, but the Swiss couldn't get involved. The Swiss media.
That's right. So the Article 47 of the banking secrecy law, which you've referred to, contains provisions which basically mean that journalists could be criminally prosecuted for publishing, disseminating information about Swiss accounts. So, you know, this is a great shame and a pity that our Swiss partners in the media world in Switzerland could not participate in this. They saw the risk too great, and so they respectfully declined to participate. And organizations such as us and our partners in other countries took on that role and responsibility.
Rudolph, do you and other Swiss people find this embarrassing? And do you think the Swiss government will cave to pressure from the United Nations to change Article 47?
Yes, it is embarrassing, but I'm strongly convinced that the Swiss Parliament will not change the Article 47 at all, because it's a money-making article, the Swiss bank secrecy. It's still the golden calf of Switzerland, and it's important for the financial industry, and not only for the financial industry, but also for the law firms and wealthy management firms, because they are in the business to engineer and enable poaching and extorting money from other countries. In my view, Swiss authorities and Swiss Parliament and even the Swiss judicial system is aiding and abetting, even condoning the increase in poverty for the man in the street in other countries.
Tom, the bank, though, dismisses the report as taking things out of context, and especially not allowing for the fact that some of these bank accounts were opened and operated during other decades at a time when such things were within the law.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a very typical response from the bank when faced with these kind of reports. You know, even when you look at the Bulgarian money laundering case that we've been discussing, you know, when this indictment was first issued, the bank's response was to say, well, this is very historical. You know, you're going back 15 years here. Why is this relevant? It is relevant because we know that these scandals continue to happen at the bank even until, you know, very recent years. And it's important to shed a light even if some years have passed. And, you know, it's important to add as well that many of these accounts did remain open until quite recent years, although some of them were, as they've said, historical.
Rudolph, I'm kind of curious, just a last question for you. How is it you think that your country is able to maintain this image of a pristine society, you know, that runs as smoothly as a Swiss clock, and yet, if you start to dig a little deeper, you find there's quite a lot of corruption going on, and that the banks, the crown jewels of Switzerland, have been hit by scandal after scandal?
Yeah, what can I say? I mean, I'm frustrated personally, and the man in the street as well, but we have a great marketing department, put it this way, in Switzerland to sell our services to the world. And in the world, there are many people who really have to hide assets somewhere, not only talking about money, but also non-financial assets. And Switzerland is providing the services for it. So for the multinationals, ultra-high net worth individuals, and even other people, criminals, serious criminals. And you have to see Credit Suisse is just an example. It's a tip of the iceberg, in my view, because many people have been trained in Switzerland with Credit Suisse and then moved to the UBS or to other smaller banks. So it's put it this way, it's a business model, a Swiss business model, in my view, which has to be stopped.
Rudolph Elmer and Tom Stocks, thank you both very much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Let's turn to our final guest now, and Robert Mazur is a former US federal agent who worked undercover as a money launderer and managed to infiltrate 2 major drug cartels in the 80s and 90s, and he exposed the corruption at the 7th largest private bank in the world, BCCI. He was also immortalized in the 2016 film The Infiltrator. Well, let's hear from Robert now. Robert, thanks so much for joining us here on The Nexus. After all these years, you still have to appear in silhouette. Do you still consider there to be a threat on your life?
Well, a lot of the people that I dealt with were very, very nasty. And I think it's just a prudent thing for one to do. There's really no place to be able to check whether or not, although many of the people I dealt with are dead, some of them are still alive.
Yeah, you infiltrated 2 cartels and you managed to expose corruption at BCCI. For some of your activities, you used a Swiss bank to conduct your business, and you also learned from corrupt bankers exactly how to launder money. What were the main techniques you picked up?
Well, there are many techniques that they used, but with respect to BCCI and some of the other international banks that have admitted criminal offenses, they often take your capital, put it into a CD in a place like Luxembourg, where it is held in a Liechtenstein foundation, and use that as assets against which they create loans in other parts of the world. And as a matter of fact, many of the loans that BCCI created, fictitious loans, were created in their London office. The money was then moved on through about 4 or 5 other haven countries, and then ultimately to accounts in Panama, where it was distributed to the drug traffickers.
In the Credit Suisse case, we heard about a client relationship manager handling suitcases full of money, sometimes up to, what, $500,000. It's important, isn't it, to be very balanced. If you're a criminal, that is, trying to launder your money, you've got to be careful not to overdo it in terms of cash.
Well, yeah, cash is definitely an eye catcher for law enforcement. But, you know, there are so many ways in which sophisticated international banks can work with intermediary companies to get that cash into businesses that can explain why they have the cash, and then move the funds through wire transfers and bounce it all over the world. So unfortunately, there is, in my view, a significant number of international bankers and businessmen who feed off of the profits of laundering drug proceeds and other illicit proceeds around the world. Credit
Suisse said, that it believed that the money, the cash, was coming from legitimate businesses. Would you expect them to say that? Let's put it that way.
Most of the account relationship managers that I dealt with that knowingly took illicit funds evaluated me and other clients who had illicit funds to determine to what degree they had plausible deniability. So they were always looking for individuals like myself, who was a money launderer for the Colombian cartels, who had businesses that they could make reference to in order to deflect the accusation that there could have been no other source of the funds other than drug proceeds. It's a pretty typical technique that's used by those who make the evaluation about whether they want to go after this hot money.
You think that bankers who engage in this sort of activity should be jailed for years, not be given suspended sentences? Why do you consider money laundering such a serious crime?
Well, I can tell you for a fact that drug cartels could not do what they do, and organized crime could not do what it does, unless it had the ability to move those mountains of cash into legitimate appearing businesses that then can be used to very subtly buy countries. I mean, we just last year, at the end of last year, extradited to the United States the recently completed the president of Honduras, who had recently completed his tenure as president, along with probably 10 or so senators from Honduras, a country that was pretty much controlled by the cartels. But we see that same type of activity in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia, Mexico, and also in Venezuela. So unfortunately, it's hard for people to recognize that, for example, in the United States last year, we lost 107,000 lives to overdoses of fentanyl. Most of those deaths were young adults. That is what's happening on the street, but what you don't realize is that the ability to be able to move those types of drugs all over the world in massive quantities takes the corrupting of governments, the corrupting of militaries, and that can't be done without the finesse of money laundering.
Robert, just a final question for you as we're running out of time. Your job would have been incredibly stressful. Any wrong move could have led to you losing your life. And it must have taken a toll on your family life as well. And I've heard in other interviews that you said it wasn't until your family saw the movie about your life that they understood why you risked it all.
That's true. It was a statement made to me by my daughter. She was very young, 9 years old when this all began. And it took until that moment when she was nearly 40 to tell me that she understood and forgave me.
Robert Mazur, thank you very much for being on The Nexus and for all the work you've done in law enforcement. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our other episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube to type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.